Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're really getting into it, some heavy stuff, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Identity liberation and the fight to define yourself authentically.
Yeah, really big questions.
Huge questions. And we're using this paper by Jaime Hoerricks. It's
Hmm.
called Who Defines Us?
Hmm.
Liberation, Identity, and the Fight for Authenticity.
Great paper.
It is. And just for some context for everyone listening, Hoerricks is an autistic trans woman. So
Right.
their perspective on all of this is really
So
valuable.
incredibly valuable. And you know what's so interesting about this paper is how Hoerricks takes these huge ideas,
Yeah.
these theoretical concepts,
Mm,
and really brings them down to earth.
yeah.
Makes them relatable through their own experiences.
For sure. And right from the jump, Horrocks doesn't hold back.
Oh, no, they don't.
They write, every facet of my identity, autistic, trans, and existing within a historically colonized heritage, intersects with systems designed to erase, marginalize, or reconfigure me into something more palatable to the status quo.
Wow.
Heavy stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a powerful statement, and it really gets to the heart of what Horrocks is wrestling with
Yeah.
in this whole paper. Who gets to define us? It's not just a question for marginalized communities.
Right.
It's for all of us. I mean, think about it. How much of who you are is shaped by what other people tell you is, okay,
Yeah.
what's normal?
Yeah.
It's something we all deal with.
It really is. When
Yeah.
you stop and think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Totally.
And Horrocks argues that liberation goes beyond just existing in those systems. It's about fighting for the right to define yourself.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they don't just talk about it theoretically.
Mm-hmm.
They bring in some really compelling historical examples.
Okay, so let's get into those. What kind of movements are we talking about here?
Well, one of the first ones they bring up is the Black Panther Party.
Okay.
They weren't just about protesting. They were about building community,
Right.
creating self-reliance. And their free breakfast for children program is a perfect example of this.
It's interesting because just on the surface, giving kids breakfast
Yeah.
might not seem like a radical act,
Right.
but the government saw it as a threat. Why do you think that was?
I think it's because it really challenged how the government saw Black communities,
Okay.
their capabilities, and their right to take care of themselves. The Black Panthers providing for their own,
Mm-hmm.
that disrupted the power dynamics.
Makes sense. It shows how even something as simple as breakfast can be powerful.
Absolutely. When it's driven by that desire for self-determination.
Yeah. And Horrocks connects this to the struggles of Indigenous Americans, too.
Yeah.
That fight for sovereignty, for cultural preservation,
Right.
always facing that pressure to assimilate.
It's a story that's been going on for centuries, hasn't
Oh,
it?
for sure. And it's still going on today,
Yeah.
like the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Exactly.
There's that connection there between fighting for liberation and fighting for the land.
Yeah.
Right, to control your own resources and destiny.
It's so central for a lot of Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
Land isn't just a resource. It's completely intertwined with their culture, their identity,
Mm-hmm.
even their existence. So protecting it becomes this fight for survival,
Sure.
for self-determination, for liberation on a fundamental level.
Okay, now Herricks also talks about indigenous Marxist movements.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about those and how they connect to liberation?
So these movements are fascinating because they blend those ideas of land and autonomy and resistance in their fight.
Oh, right.
They see the fight against capitalism as completely tied up with the struggle for indigenous rights and self-determination.
So it's acknowledging that economic and cultural liberation are connected.
Exactly. You
Right.
can't have one without the other, and this idea is a huge theme throughout Horrocks' paper.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern emerging here, right? These different movements,
Yeah.
despite all their differences.
Mhm.
They all point to this thing where external systems are trying to control them.
They try to define them.
It's about power, isn't it?
It is.
Who gets to decide what the story is, what liberation even means?
Absolutely. It's about understanding those power dynamics and then actively challenging them.
Which brings us up to today.
Yes.
And all the challenges facing movements for neurodivergent and trans liberation,
Mm.
even in a place like California, which is supposed to be progressive.
Right.
Herricks is really honest about the obstacles.
Yeah.
What are some of those challenges?
One of the big ones is how fragmented the landscape is these days.
Okay.
It's like we've lost that sense of unity that we saw in some of those older movements.
Less of a united front, more like a lot of scattered efforts.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that fragmentation makes these movements vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's harder to gain traction,
Right.
challenge the status quo when everyone's off doing their own thing.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What's contributing to that fragmentation?
Well, one thing is this focus on individualism,
Okay.
especially with social media. It's all about personal branding and influencer culture.
So instead of working together, we're all competing for attention and followers.
Yeah, and it's such a contrast to those older movements.
Yeah.
Think about the Black Panthers. Their power came from their collective action. They weren't worried about individual recognition.
Yeah.
They were focused on building a movement to challenge the system.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And it makes you think that maybe this individualism is undermining things today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have those mainstream narratives that are trying to erase or demonize autistic and trans people.
Like the Autism Cares Act.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It puts so much money into finding a cure instead of actually supporting autistic people,
Right.
or all those anti-trans laws popping up.
It's like they're trying to define these identities out of existence.
Yeah.
And Hoerricks also points out how this Eurocentric framing makes things harder.
Right.
Can you explain what they mean by that?
Sure. So Eurocentric framing is all about how Western culture values individual achievement and fitting in
Okay.
more than the collective good and embracing differences.
So it's about fitting into the existing system, not creating something new that actually values those differences.
Exactly. And this lack of a shared cultural framework, a shared sense of identity and purpose, makes these movements weak.
Okay.
Hoerricks compares it to trying to build a house without a foundation.
I like that analogy.
You might put up some walls, but it's not going to last.
So we've got fragmentation, hostile narratives, and this lack of a shared foundation.
Yeah.
Where do we even go from here? I mean, I know Hoerricks doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture.
Oh, yeah.
They offer some really insightful ways to think about these issues, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to explore next.
Okay.
We'll be getting into Hoerricks' thoughts on perfectionism and the need for a more nuanced understanding of liberation.
Okay, so we're talking about some pretty intense stuff. Hostile narratives, that lack of a shared foundation for these movements. But like you mentioned, Hoerricks doesn't just leave us hanging.
No, they don't.
They go on to critique some of the ways we think about social change, and this demand for perfection really stood out to me.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
What's their take on that?
So Hoerricks argues that this expectation of flawlessness, especially in the global north, it actually ends up hurting movements. It sets this impossible standard for leaders and organizations.
Right.
And it creates this culture of fear where people are afraid to speak up or make mistakes.
That makes sense. If you're constantly worried about being perfect, you're probably less likely to take risks to experiment.
Exactly. It can stifle creativity and innovation.
Yeah.
And honestly, who can live up to that standard of perfection anyway? Nobody's.
Right.
It ends up excluding a lot of people who could contribute so much.
Yeah. And it kind of ties into Hoerricks' critique of binary thinking, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
That idea that everything is either right or wrong, good or bad, no room for nuance.
No in between.
And they use this really interesting example to illustrate this point, the case of Sarah McBride.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
For anyone listening who isn't familiar, can you give us some background on Sarah McBride?
Sure. Sarah McBride is a trans woman and a state senator. She's a real trailblazer in a lot of ways.
Right.
But during her campaign, she got support from AIPAC,
Okay.
which is this lobbying group that a lot of progressives see as problematic.
Right.
And this sparked a huge debate,
Yeah.
about whether accepting that support meant she was compromising her values.
So it's this real dilemma, right?
Yeah.
You've got this incredible leader breaking down barriers,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's this association that raises concerns.
It really makes you think about the complexities of working within these systems.
We can't just stay completely pure.
No.
So how does this connect back to Hoerricks' point about perfectionism?
So this is where it gets really interesting. Hoerricks argues that demanding this kind of purity from leaders, it's just not realistic.
Okay.
And in the end, it's not helpful. Politics is messy.
For sure.
There are compromises that have to be made.
It seems like Hoerricks is pushing for a more nuanced way of thinking about leadership.
Yes, and accountability too.
So it's not about letting people off the hook,
No, not at all.
but it's also not about demanding perfection,
Right.
because that's just not possible.
Exactly. Instead of demanding perfection, we should focus on creating a culture of accountability
Okay.
where people can admit when they mess up,
Right.
learn from it, and then grow.
It's holding people accountable without shutting down conversation.
Yes. Without creating that atmosphere of fear.
So less about finding a perfect leader, more about building a movement where everyone can contribute.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And this leads into another important part of the paper,
Okay.
the discussion of identity, privilege, and solidarity.
This is where things get really personal, right?
Yeah.
Hoerricks talks about their own experiences and
Mhm.
how those experiences shape their view of liberation.
Exactly. They talk about being an autistic trans woman of West Highland
Yeah.
origin,
Mm-hmm.
and they acknowledge that some people might question their understanding of oppression because of their light skin and European heritage. But at the same time, their identity as an autistic and trans person puts them right in the line of fire.
It's a good reminder that we can't make assumptions about people's experiences based on how they look.
Exactly. Identity is complicated. People can hold multiple identities,
Right.
and sometimes those identities can even be at odds with each other.
And that leads to one of the most important takeaways from the paper. True solidarity means seeing how privilege works, but without reducing people to just those privileges.
Right. You have to see the whole person.
Acknowledge their privileges and their oppressions.
Yes. And understand that liberation isn't this zero-sum game. Recognizing those differences in privilege and oppression is actually how we build bridges.
It's recognizing that our struggles are connected.
Exactly. Even if we experience them in different ways.
Which leads to Hoerricks's call for a movement that goes beyond just dismantling oppressive systems. It's about building something new.
Yes. They talk about the importance of building cultural foundations for liberation. And they draw on the work of thinkers like Walimu Barudi and Marimba Ani.
Can you give us a quick overview of their ideas?
Sure. So both Barudi and Ani emphasize cultural autonomy, reclaiming identity and meaning-making from outside forces.
So it's not just about tearing down the old. It's
Right.
about building something new that reflects our values.
Exactly. And Hoerricks takes it a step further. They talk about moving beyond just survival
Okay.
and creating spaces where trans and neurodivergent identities can actually thrive.
That's a beautiful idea, shifting from defense to creation and empowerment.
It is. And Hoerricks doesn't just leave us with this lofty ideal.
Right.
They actually offer some concrete steps for how to start building those cultural foundations.
So what are those steps?
Well, they lay out these core principles for organizing alternatives to the status quo,
Okay.
emphasizing self-definition, collective action, mutual aid, and cultural preservation.
So what do those principles look like in action?
Well, one concrete step is building support networks that go beyond just digital spaces.
Okay.
Platforms like Zoom or Discord might not work for everyone.
Right.
So it's about recognizing that face-to-face interaction is still vital.
Yeah, especially for communities that are often pushed to the margins.
Exactly. It's about building spaces that are accessible, culturally relevant, and rooted in grassroots organizing.
And what about this idea of collective action?
Oh, that's huge.
Hmm.
Hoerricks is advocating for moving away from that single charismatic leader model and embracing a more distributed, collaborative approach to leadership.
Okay, so less hierarchy, more shared responsibility.
Exactly. It makes movements more resilient and it opens up more opportunities for people to participate.
And finally, Hoerricks talks about reframing accountability.
Yes.
It's not about punishment, it's about growth.
Right. It's recognizing that we're all imperfect, we all make mistakes, and that the point of accountability is to learn and restore.
So it's really about changing how we think about being part of a movement.
Yeah.
It's less about following rigid rules and more about creating spaces where people can be themselves, learn from each other, and work together to create real change.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what makes this paper so powerful. It's not just a critique. It's a roadmap for building a better world.
A world that actually celebrates difference.
Yeah. And it all comes back to that final message from Hoerricks. Liberation starts when we define ourselves.
Such a powerful idea.
It's about taking back our narratives,
Yeah.
our identities, our power.
And that's a revolutionary act.
Absolutely. So, listener, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you with that question that Hoerricks asks.
That's a good one.
If you could create a world that truly celebrates and values neurodivergent and trans identities, what would it look like?
As we're wrapping up this deep dive into Hoerricks' work, I keep thinking about the sheer scope of what they're asking us to consider.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about like small changes here and there. It's about completely changing how we think about identity and liberation and social change.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah.
And what I really appreciate is that Hoerricks doesn't pretend it's easy. They acknowledge that there's no quick fix.
No magic solution.
No. They talk about the limitations of past movements,
Yeah.
the challenges of working within systems that are flawed, the messy reality of trying to build coalitions. It's
Yeah.
all right there in the paper.
But even with all that, there's still this sense of hope.
Yeah.
This belief that we can make things better.
It's not like naive optimism, though.
Right.
It's this grounded hope that comes from Really understanding the struggles, the complexities, and still choosing to believe that things can change.
Like that saying, hope is a verb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not just a feeling you have.
Right.
It's an active choice to keep fighting, even when it feels impossible.
And for me, one of the most hopeful parts of Hoerricks' work is that emphasis on self-definition.
Oh,
They
yeah.
write, liberation begins when we define ourselves on our own terms.
So powerful.
It really is. It's like they're giving us permission to break free from all those boxes and labels and expectations.
Exactly. We don't have to accept those limitations.
Mm.
We can reclaim our own narratives, shape our own identities,
Mhm.
and create a world that reflects who we really are.
It's about creating space for everyone to do that.
Yes, a culture where we celebrate difference and recognize the value in every single person.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into Hoerricks' work, we want to leave you with that question one last time.
The big one.
If you could design a world that celebrates and values neurodivergent and trans identities, what would it look like?
What systems would you put in place? How would education, healthcare, even social services be structured?
What kind of communities would we build?
Take some time to really think about this. Let it spark your imagination, challenge your assumptions, and inspire you to dream big. Because the world we create starts with the worlds we can imagine.
And remember, liberation isn't something that's just given to us. It's something we build together. It's a journey of learning and unlearning, challenging the status quo and creating something new, something better, something more just. And that journey begins with each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.